got one from you yesterday. Yeah, yes, I did. Yeah, I'm going to follow up. Yeah, I will.
You seem genuine.
I will. I will follow up with him.
Yeah, thanks.
We're getting ready to start.
Okay. And Claus is on the phone. Where's?
Right here.
Claus, are you there? I just want to make sure we can hear you. Okay. All right. All right. Then it's 10 o'clock. I'm going to go ahead and call this special town council meeting to order. And we only have one subject of business, which is to consider the approval of an additional emergency measure to address public safety concerns in response to the recent and persistent increase in COVID-19 cases in the greater Charleston area, or specifically to consider an ordinance that addresses the use of face coverings, face masks in different public areas within the town of Kiowa Island. I want to make a couple. Where am I hearing?
That's the noise out of the phone.
Oh, okay. I want to make sure we have a really good full discussion about this before we put something in front of ourselves to vote. And a couple things. One, I will tell you that we sent this out yesterday publicly for comment. And I have to say that in the six years that I have been doing this, this is the most number of comments that I have ever seen us receive on any subject whatsoever, which was frankly refreshing. We got a lot of emails. I was still counting this morning, but I was up to about, as I said 87, actually as I walked out of my office, I was up to about 94. Of people who had responded with some sort of comment on the ordinance, and I'll summarize those for you as we go through here. In addition to Kiowa, we also probably got 3 or 4 emails from Seabrook as well, because as you think of it, they are customers of Freshfields, and most of their comments had to do with Freshfields. So clearly, this has hit a chord with respect to the concern that we have in the greater community. When we go through this, what I want to do is make certain that what comes out of this is an ordinance and an action that, from my perspective, kind of accomplishes 3 things. I mean, most importantly, it needs to be effective in addressing the problems that we are in fact trying to address. And I know in the last week there are more and more communities that have or are in the process of looking at similar ordinances. Some of them are really similar in terms of the language and the things they do. Some of them are very different. But ultimately what we need to be focused on is Kiowa. We're not Charleston, we're not Greenville, we're not IOP. So what I want to make sure is that we end up with an ordinance here that speaks to our community and our issues and what we're trying to address. At the same time, I also want to make sure that we have something that is absolutely as clear and as easy to understand as possible. If we are going to get cooperation with this, the more that we try to, and I'm guilty of this in some initial versions of trying to get too cute in what I'm writing and how we're trying to address a particular problem, that it makes it very hard to understand and more difficult to enforce. So I hope that as we go through this, we will end up, or at least be driven a little bit by clarity and ease of enforcement, and not end up with something that is just so many wherewiths and provisions and exceptions and so on that it becomes difficult. And I don't think what we have in front of us here has that problem right now, but I want to make sure as we go through and make changes that we still keep it simple. And finally, we have to be concerned with, and I think end up with a ordinance here that is enforceable. And that is one of our chief challenges. And I think I won't be surprised in this discussion if we get into a whole debate about what are the relative benefits of putting the right message out there, even though you know you can't enforce it, versus not doing things that you know you cannot enforce. And enforcement is a challenge that we've got to recognize. At the end of the day, we do not have our own police force. And we have limited staff. And so while this entire ordinance is driven with the concept that people will self-police themselves, that they will cooperate, that there will be a minimum of enforcement need, nonetheless, we know in reality that we've got to be able to enforce. And so I think there are things here that we clearly know we can. There are some, particularly in many of the emails that we received, there are a lot of very good suggestions, but they really walk on the edge of our ability to enforce. So again, I want to get that out as something we've got to be thinking about. I want to suggest as a way to go through this, that rather than simply putting the proposed ordinance immediately out on the table as an asking for a motion, and taking an initial vote to open it up for discussion, what I'd like to do is just have us right now, maybe almost in a roundtable fashion, let's walk through this as a group, the specific provisions of the ordinance, one by one. I think as we do, a combination of Stephanie and myself will highlight the feedback that we heard on that particular item, which would be relevant to our action or decisions. What did we hear from residents or from the public? That will be an opportunity for each of you to get out on the table your own, what you've heard, your own views. But what I'd like to do is just go through each one. Are we clear? Are we comfortable with it? Are we clear what it means? Are there any changes, conceptually, any changes that we would recommend or want to make in that item? When we do that, we'll table that piece for a while. That will be an opportunity for our town attorney, I hope to add in if he has any input or concerns or issues about any of the direction we might want to go, and walk through all of the provisions, get a sense of where we're at. Then what we'll do is, in the more formal fashion, I'll ask for a motion to approve the ordinance. At that point, we can then go through any amendments that any council members would want to propose that came out of our earlier discussion. That'll allow us to clean it up, and then we can vote on a final proposal. Does that
That makes sense.
work for everybody? Claus, were you able to, I keep turning away from where your little box is over here. Can you hear all of that?
Well, the last two sentences when you said you keep turning away from the mic and I heard those very well. Sort of the rest of your explanation, it tends to get a little faint. So
All right,
I know it's a pain that I'm on the phone, and I apologize, but if you guys could really speak clearly into the mic, that would be really helpful.
all right, you're closer now to where I'm at. I'll talk to the mic. First thing, then we're gonna start, let's go ahead and start at number one, and I
I'm hearing nothing at all. Did I annoy everyone?
that would be two different questions, Claus.
I pushed the wrong button.
Okay, can you hear me?
Very well, thank you.
Yeah, okay. All right, so what I'm gonna suggest is that we just, this may be laborious, but we walk through each one, because I wanna make sure we've got it. Before we go, to summarize, at a very high level, the feedback, and then I can give you specific as we go through on particular items. As I said, I heard from about somewhere between high 80s, low 90s emails that came in either directly to me or directly to Stephanie or both. There also was a fair amount of chatter on the town's Facebook page, although that is often a different audience. It's hard to tell whether that's being residents and property owners and interested people here who are out commenting on Facebook, or whether that's could be anywhere. What I will tell you is that of the emails that I got, possibly with the exception of one, every other email was completely supportive. Now, when I say completely supportive, they had specific things they didn't like, provisions they wanted to change, but in terms of do we need to pass an ordinance that requires the use of face coverings for a period of time on Kiowa Island, it was essentially, with the exception, I think, of one email, was essentially unanimous. Where the differences then occurred, or the comments, I would say about half of them that I received, and Stephanie, you correct me if you see it differently, about half of them sort of stopped there. We support the ordinance, this needs to be done, we appreciate your doing it, and there was really no further comment except, we want to indicate our support and that you do it. Probably the other half, or just less than a half, had some element that they generally wanted to see stronger. So it wasn't do less, and it was in all cases. I have an area that I think it's too weak, and we'll get into those, but mostly it had to do around the ordinance that relates to people waiting for dining, takeout, and that language, and the concern about this not covering some other public areas where social distancing isn't or can't be accommodated. So we'll get into those. So overall, it was extremely supportive. Where people didn't like it, it was because I want you to do something more. And I think people were very, very specific in the things that they were looking for. Did you hear anything different? And when I get a chance, I would have liked to have emailed back each of those people and thanked them. They were coming across so fast we couldn't, but we will at some point. I'll sit at the computer and forward them to you all, and you can see all of the emails.
I believe we've seen them, have we
You see
not?
the ones that I received,
Okay.
or the ones that Patrick received, if any was sent directly to the mayor, we will get those.
You'll
to
get
you,
those
but
too. I was
definitely
just,
received about probably 50, at least half of them.
yeah.
You have copies of.
All right, so let's go through it. So number one is the directives and procedures adopted by the town's prior emergency ordinance, number 20-03 remains in place and is not amended or rescinded by this emergency ordinance. Joe, I don't know if you have any comments. That's a straightforward. All we're trying to do there is make clear that everything else that we've done to this point is still in effect in all of our earlier ordinances. That's all, right?
It should be R. That's my fault.
Number two is a definition of face covering or mask. I did not get in any of the feedback that we got. Did I hear anyone actually address this? I did not hear anybody who had concerns or raised issues, or what I was looking to often was to make sure that people were not finding any areas of confusion where our language wasn't clear. So this seemed to be a non-issue. I know I've compared this to some of the language used in some of the other municipalities. It seems to be all-encompassing. So I did not see any issues with this. I don't know whether
No.
everybody's good with it. All right. All persons, including employees, entering any business other than a restaurant must wear a face covering while inside the establishment. Businesses are required to post a notice in their business visible to customers entering the business or waiting to enter the business, informing customers that the use of face coverings by customers and employees is mandated by law. Again, I heard in a few places there was some lack of understanding. Some people in reading it, because you have to read this one in conjunction with the next one that talks about restaurants. So some people read it, oh, this isn't affecting restaurants. why are you excluding them? And the answer is, well, we're not. We just are handling that in the next paragraph. But I did not see any real differences of opinion or comments around this, which is really the core item of the ordinance, that all employees working in all businesses on the island need to be wearing face masks, with the exception of restaurants, who we will talk about in a minute in a different paragraph, and all customers in a business need to have a face mask while they are inside of that business. And, I heard full support on that. There was, again, some confusion. Well, what business, was it just some businesses, all businesses? Our reading of this is that it is broadly all-encompassing. Stephanie, did you hear any other comments? So, there was an earlier version of this that which some of you saw, or maybe all of you saw, where we had for a while the idea of trying to differentiate between essential and non-essential businesses, and give non-essential businesses some option to take a different approach. It was very clear that that was a non-starter, so I didn't even bring it to the council for discussion today. I reviewed it with some people at Freshfield, some of our businesses, and basically, while I thought that we were potentially giving them some additional options, they really were looking more for make it straight, simple, clear, and those were considered to be too complicated. So, any discussion, any comments on this one?
The only question, Mr. Mayor, I would have is whether or not people reading this would interpret a club, for example, the Keel Island Club, the Governor's Club, as a business. And do we intend to include those establishments in this ordinance? I trust we do.
We do.
And it may be clear to most people. That's the question I would have, is it clear that that includes clubs?
Do we need to?
I'm sorry, Dan, sorry. Is it clear that that includes what?
Clubs.
Clubs.
Keel Island Club, the Governor's Club, which are major institutions on our island, which is different.
Yeah. It is intended to cover those entities, yes.
And they do have their own rules on this too.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
they
I mean,
tend to be following.
Yeah, and there's never going to be anything that prevents any business from having a more severe, a more restrictive,
No,
right.
and they've all been following things.
So this does cover, in the case of the resort, I mean, they have retail shops, they have retail,
Right.
so it covers those. It covers the club. I don't know whether, does that need to be?
More clarity never hurts. I certainly have no problem with adding, including, would be private clubs, or even all
They're private.
All club facilities.
club facilities.
I would say all club facilities would be very clear then to people. In most communities, it wouldn't be a big issue. Here, it's a major thing in Keel Island. We have a lot of members who are either Governor's Club members or Keel Island Club members, and I think for the sake of clarity, just a little bit of an addition would help.
Since we're clarifying, and it really is a restaurant, but the community association is essentially not a club.
Right.
How do we
Club or association.
how do we deal with them?
How about club or
Club or
association?
That sounds good.
That just makes it
It adds.
clear. Yeah.
Club or association facilities.
Fine, great.
Anything else in 3? Any other comments? Claus, any comments?
No, given that you clarified that restaurants are going to be addressed next, I don't have anything.
Okay. All right. Restaurants are addressed in different ways in number 4 and 5. Number 4 deals with employees. And I think to understand number 4, we need to step back and remember the actions that the governor has taken to this point. If you recall, originally restaurants had been shut down by the governor's order. He then issued an order that allowed modified outdoor dining and then ultimately indoor dining, but he made the indoor dining subject to the voluntary guidelines that had been put forth by the South Carolina Restaurant Association and endorsed by the Accelerate One group. And that is what our restaurants on Kiowa have been, per the governor's order, following. And, you know, they're very long. They deal with an array of issues, everything from how far tables should be spaced to all of the different hygiene issues and so on. Additionally, as you know, we had MUSC work with a number of our businesses, particularly the club and the resort. They did not end up, not very many of the restaurants in Freshfields took advantage of the opportunity, but the 2 large ones did. What we're trying to do here is, in those guidelines, there were guidelines with respect to the use of face coverings by employees, but they were more in the matter of you should do this, or where reasonable, or it was still a guideline. It was not a requirement. What we're trying to do with this is to say that for restaurants, while we are not otherwise tampering with all of the rest of the Restaurant Association guidelines, that we're making the use of face coverings by the employees who interact with customers to make that mandatory. Now, we heard, again, and I'll look to Stephanie, I think we heard a significant amount of feedback in the public comments that we got on this particular item. A very strong view. First, we heard a lot about the inconsistencies that people saw, that they would go into one restaurant and people have face masks, they go into another one, they don't. They'll go into one restaurant and it's different depending upon the individual people. So we heard I think we heard a strong desire for this change. We heard in a few cases, but it was only a few, a desire to even extend this and go farther and require it of all employees inside of restaurants. Personally, I'm reluctant to go that next step, only because at this point, the Restaurant Association guidelines haven't requested it. MUSC has not made that a recommendation or requirement in all cases, and I'm not sure in some cases the impact when you have, you know, fry cooks and, you know, what the backroom impact is. I do appreciate and understand the concern residents have about that. So I think it's an area for discussion. Clearly there is support for item number 4 as we've written it. I think the only question is there any strong argument or feeling that it should be more encompassing than what it is? And I'll open up to comment.
Mayor, I have a comment, and I didn't know whether I should bring it up now or later in the discussion, but it regards 2 things. First is the restaurant employees that are in the back room. I do feel they should be wearing masks. They are preparing the food, they're right over it. If anyone should have them, I think they should be. But my other comment is more about another statement that I was wondering if could be added. And it says that in a public area where it is not possible to maintain social distancing.
We haven't gotten to that one yet.
Okay.
Okay. We're still on number 4, so hold that
I
to
know,
number,
I was gonna
hold
add
that
it
to
in
number
there.
5, okay? Yeah, but I do want to get to that one from
To
you.
4.
Okay.
Greg, can you hear me?
Yep,
I didn't hear anything Mary Ann said, so if this is duplication, I apologize. I go back and forth on the issue of all employees in a restaurant, so I think I'm gonna stay out of that. I can see both sides of that. I think this is a small thing, and I understand how this is drafted, point 4. I really think it is confusing. I know point 4 reads, they are required, but they are required to implement something that is expressly called a recommendation. So, I don't know if this makes sense or not, but I would add to point 4, something along the lines of, for the avoidance of doubt, all employees in a restaurant having contact with customers must wear a face covering. I just would like this to be very clear.
I get it. And it is, and you're correct that by the fact that we are referencing the South Carolina Restaurant and Lodging Association language, which probably 3 of us have read,
That's right.
Number
I-
of
for no reason other than it's not, it's
like
a
to have it in
long
there.
document.
Right.
That we probably we probably should make this a clearer statement that what we could end up doing is having the language we have, but then add to that says, which therefore requires
Yes.
that all restaurant employees, and depending on then whether it's all or whether it's those that have contact with the public, must wear a
Right.
mask at all times.
Because
I think that's
I would agree.
That sounds good to me.
I think I agree with that confusion because it looks like I might be adopting a suggestion, which is not what we're doing.
What we were trying to do was to say what we're turning as a suggestion into a
To a
requirement.
forceful, right.
That was
Yeah.
what was
The other-
intended.
Related to this, the other thing I would mention is I was at a Freshfields restaurant this weekend, and a large one.
We'll
and-
move down.
Yeah, yeah.
Sorry, that was,
I mean, we were socially distanced away from anyway.
yeah.
We ate in what I would call a major outside dining area, which many restaurants have adopted because many clients would prefer to eat there rather than inside. Half of the not half exactly, but many external employees, that is, employees dealing with us, were wearing face masks. Some were not. I don't think it's clear, if we leave this just the way it is, that we're suggesting that patron-facing employees, whether they're serving inside the restaurant or outside the restaurant, in an outside space, must wear face masks. I'd be clear about that issue, because I don't think it's clear today.
And that is what this is intended to do,
I
so
know,
it's a
I'm
question
with
of
you.
clarity.
Joe, any comments on that?
I think it's an issue that a lot of towns have struggled with from a legal standpoint. All employees versus front of the house employees is either one is fine from a legal standpoint.
Yeah, I'm only suggesting
But I think
what I
you're,
call front of house, but outside the premises.
you're saying that even the person who brings the pizza out to the
Right.
street
Right.
needs to have a face mask.
Or the person, in our case, it was a server serving an outside table who was not wearing a mask.
What they should,
Well,
I think that if we say something along the lines of what Craig sort of pulled out of his hat there, which something along the lines of, so that means that all front office employees have to wear a mask. I think that makes it pretty clear, because whether they're sort of inside or outside, they're front office employees.
Yeah, I would go a step further, Claus, and just say whether serving clients inside or outside the building.
Fair enough.
Just,
Clarity doesn't hurt.
any employee that interacts, because interacts with a customer, you gotta start thinking about hosts,
right, the host and host, right.
they're not serving food.
Yeah.
okay.
And actually, because that's the language, if I recall, if you go back to the actual language in the Restaurant Association we've preferenced, that language really deals with the definitions I recall is who interacts with the customer.
Yeah, But
So-
interacts is
Okay,
good
so we can clean that up.
Okay.
All right, now we'll get to the one that I know both Mary Ann and Claus want to address. Number 5, all persons waiting to enter a business establishment must wear a mask unless they can maintain social distancing of at least 6 feet from other persons other than members of the same family. This is the area that we heard the most comments from the public, specifically as it related to restaurants. And the issue is the concern that, one, that the way we were trying to address the issue, which was putting in some discretion for people to say, well, are we socially distanced or not? If you've got 5 people lined up in front of Latella, if they're all spread out, this was defined to say, okay, as long as they're spread out, they're okay. I think we strongly heard from the emails that we got that in practice that's too complicated and it doesn't work because it's adding, in fact, too much discretion. Now you're into the eyes of the beholder of, well, you think we're far enough apart, but I don't think we're far enough apart. And people are moving around, and so that distance is changing all the time. And so I think we heard a very strong concern that language needed to be clear. And also what was striking to me was how much of a concern this was. I guess a lot more people must be eating out than I have, because they clearly had experiences that they were relating that this just, I went to pick up a pizza or I was waiting to be seated in some restaurant and it was, I felt so uncomfortable, because people were all aggregating, there wasn't any distancing. So what we heard pretty strongly from the public feedback was a desire to simplify this, to say that anybody who is waiting to be seated at a restaurant and or waiting to receive takeout food should be wearing a mask at all times until they are seated or until they have their food. Stephanie, have I captured that the same as you heard it?
Yes, absolutely. There was just concern, examples with Java. There's a line, people waiting to get their coffee, and people are just on top of each other, so I think we covered it.
Yeah, the sense, and again, I haven't done a whole lot of, and I don't mind, we're picking on, where we heard examples. Java was an example where clearly people, they wait inside, their line is really, really tight. And people are going, hey, I'm not, once I'm in there, I can't even hardly get out. I got to run the gauntlet. Restaurants where there's a very small street space, so I heard Latella, because you're just kind of in a small little line there. Or places where you're inside of another building, some of the resort restaurants where the resort is inside doing a fantastic job, but what's going on outside is uncomfortable to the people that are there stationed to, so. But let me open up to each of you, comments, what you're hearing, what you would like to see.
Okay, I have a statement that is going to be a little, I'm sure it'll bring up some discussion. But one of the recommendations that I had is that any public place on Kiowa, any area where it is not possible to maintain social distancing, people should wear a mask when there are other people around. Now, why would I suggest that? I've had people ask me about the bike paths, about the boardwalks, and about other areas like that. Personally, it's on the bike paths. Anyone who's not familiar, I was on a bike path. I walk on them all the time. And the other day I went a distance of about 2 miles, and I counted the people. There were 112 people that, were walking at the same time or riding their bikes. And the concern that I had was people say that they come up to you, and you're walking or riding a bike, people come up to you, you don't know that they're there until they're right on top of you. And there was a concern that they're just too close for comfort, so to speak. So I thought by having this statement, and I believe the town of Charleston has it, it would cover all those unnamed areas.
So, sorry, can I just ask, I heard most of that. Marion, you're basically saying, are you saying you're in line with those residents or owners who commented that this should include, the mask ban should include all outdoor areas where you could not reliably social distance by 6 feet at all times, to include boardwalks, sidewalks, bike paths, all that. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, Klaus, and the reason I said it that way is because Freshfields is a good example. People walking around and window shopping, or people on the grass, or people on the playground. They're there, rather than name every single area and possibly miss something, I thought this would be a way to make sure that masks are worn.
Okay, can I, and so here, in order to kind of manage the discussion, what I'm going to ask to do is, because that is an area that we heard a lot of conversation on, and it is something that's not currently in the ordinance, and it is something that is different than what number 5 is.
Right.
Because 5 is actually dealing with the question of people who are specifically waiting to enter or a business establishment.
Right.
So what I'd like to do, if I can, because I know Claus wants to talk about this issue as well, is let's deal with the additional ones on here, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then let's come back, because I think we need to have a discussion. That we clearly heard that issue, and I think this is going to be a really tricky one for us to discuss, because it gets into the whole question of enforcement, what's feasible, what's not feasible. So can we, can I ask you, Marion, to
Yes,
hold
Mayor.
that for a little while, and then we'll come back to that piece
You
of it?
said wait for 5, I waited for 5, I'll wait till later.
Okay. Yeah, I just want to make sure we keep them in the right spot, okay? Because this one is very specific
No
about the
problem.
question of, okay, around restaurants,
I understand.
at what point does someone need to have a mask? Chris? Dan?
I would support the idea of having a mask on while you're waiting to enter the restaurant, or if you're milling around on the sidewalk in front of the establishment, trying to get in, so I have no issues with that.
I would support it as well. I'm wondering whether or not the exclusion of other than members of the same family or household makes sense. Because, to be fair, if there's 4 or 5 of them standing there, there's a likelihood that some of them will be children and so on. They wander around. I mean, it's hard to maintain, quote, social distance. And I would say it's just easier to say, if you're waiting in line,
Well, I think if we eliminate the 6-foot requirement, you would be eliminating that part, because that distinction,
You put a period after the word mask.
yeah,
Got it,
that
okay.
distinction only comes
Yeah.
about
Okay.
because
That's
you're doing the 6 feet. If the 6
Okay.
feet goes, that distinction goes.
I'm with you. Then I'm in favor of that. Eliminating those 2 factors, or those related factors, yeah.
All right. Now, we do have some exemptions. I actually did not hear any in the public comments we got. I don't recall that I heard any comments with regard to the exemptions. These are fairly consistent with what we are seeing in other ordinances, although I will say the age of 3 and older is all over the place. I think some have used 10, some have used 2, some have, Stephanie, did you hear any comments in this area? Council members, any discussion, comments
No,
to
no.
those?
I only question number E, or letter E, because if there's a family in a business establishment, isn't there an employee in the business establishment?
Yeah,
Yes.
Persons? Say that again.
Well, on E, it says persons exclusively with members of a family or same household, and no other person other than such family or household is within the same enclosed area. My thought is if they're in a business, there's an employee in that business.
Yeah.
Right.
What was the, Town attorney, can you?
I didn't understand that one either.
Well, I'm looking at Joe in the back of the room here, to see if he can,
That was a standard exemption, that was an.
and you don't have to walk up to the podium if you don't want. We're trying to keep everybody distanced here today, so.
It was just a standard exemption that was in several of them. I'm not sure exactly what that's supposed to be. I guess if you have a private room in a restaurant, perhaps.
But you're gonna be served by somebody.
Yeah,
Right.
I think,
That's right.
I have zero problem with
Take
taking
it
it out.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask, how many people know what it means?
Well, I know what it means, I just think
I
it's
think-
not right.
I mean, where it would be applicable, that's
Yeah,
what,
that-
I guess the real
can't
question,
think
I
of
guess I'm
I
not
can
sure.
think of several places at the Keo Island Club where you can reserve a private room
There you go.
for this exact purpose, you know, it's a 50th anniversary party or something, and you've got 10 family members seated at a table. But you're gonna be served by several people for that to happen, and therefore, I would say, we eliminate E.
Klaus, could you say that again?
It should be
Well, I
eliminated
was
too.
just saying, I don't think
Doesn't
we
make
need
any
that
sense.
exemption, because if you have a private room, I read it as a private room, I couldn't come up with anything else. But if you are with your family, in a celebration in a private room at the club, you are seated at the table, and therefore don't have to wear a mask anyway.
If you're actively eating.
If you're actively eating, and if you're not actively eating, you ought to be wearing a mask. I think we can eliminate E.
Well, you know, maybe we should discuss what actively eating means. I think.
Yeah.
No one talks.
Or drink. I don't think anyone here is suggesting that you wear your mask, pull it down briefly to take a bite, and then pull it back up.
No, no.
If I can just add, I think, because I see a lot coming from other jurisdictions, so what, the simple thing that Charleston did, they said when a person is alone or only with other household members in an enclosed space, that's it. So I think we've added just a little bit more in there, but that's all the city of Charleston. It says, while the city is requiring the use of face coverings or masks in public, the following shall exempt from provisions of this emergency order. When a person is alone or only with other household members in an enclosed space.
All right, so what do we want to do with this?
I think we should leave it out.
I would eliminate it.
I would eliminate it.
Okay. By the way, I follow sometimes my phone during these meetings because people who are listening are writing. And just to clarify, some people who cannot hear Claus, it's because Claus is not here. So he can't use the microphone. He's on the phone here.
I'm here.
Yeah, no, I mean, he's not physically here. You're always with us in spirit, but he's not physically.
Praise the Lord, yeah.
But he's not physically here, so that's why so we'll try to do, tell you what, I have 2 microphones. I'm gonna try that.
Say something, Klaus. We're testing a microphone, say something.
Hello, chaps.
That's better.
All right, we'll try that.
It's not
Profound.
getting double feed. If it does get double feed, then we'll just,
Well, right now, we're not,
oh, this one?
oh, because that one's on, okay.
But then you may not hear the mayor.
Yeah, yeah, so Claus is on a phone.
There you go. How about we just-
There we go. All right, so let's move to number 7. Businesses and restaurants are responsible for enforcing this emergency ordinance with regard to their employees only and are subject to the penalties included herein for violations occurring inside of their business by employees. Essential businesses, and I do want to say the word essential needs to come out. That got in there from an earlier distinction we were trying to make. Businesses and restaurants are required to post a notice in their business visible to customers entering the business, informing customers that the use of face coverings by customers' employees is mandated by law. The failure to post such a notice is a violation of this emergency ordinance. What all of that is saying is really 2 things. One, that the businesses and restaurants, their responsibility is around ensuring that they are following the guidelines for their employees.
Now we're getting feedback.
Now we're getting
No,
feedback.
yeah.
Okay. that they're responsible for their employees.
Yeah, that's not gonna work.
All right. And what that means is that with respect to penalties for the public, which is talked about elsewhere, that is the town's responsibility for enforcing. The second thing is this does require that businesses must post both the requirements of the ordinance and that failure to post the ordinance is also a violation. So, so there is a requirement here on businesses that they have to ensure that with regard to their employees, where the ordinance requires them to wear a face mask, that they are doing that. And the amount of the penalty, if a monetary penalty is necessary, is in a following provision.
Mr. Mayor, I'd like to suggest a change in the wording though, so other than to say they post a notice in their business, I would suggest they post a notice at each entry point to their business.
And that's a good point. And interestingly, already if you walk around Freshfields, there are a couple businesses who, are already requesting it. And there are a couple signs on a couple doors that they grab your attention pretty quick.
Yeah, they're pretty serious.
They look serious. You can really in signage kind of make it look, fine, or
Yeah. Although in
Don't
the
walk through
Freshfields case, the exit door is supposed to be the exit door, but it's also an ingress door.
People
So
entrance.
that's why somehow we need to capture that in each possible entryway, there should be signage, because people do go in that outdoor.
Mr. Mayor, I don't think we need to change this language any more than has been suggested already, but would it make sense for the town to send an email or something, communication to business owners outlining what we expect to see in that message?
yes.
To make sure that the good ones are already doing a good job, but the ones who may not capture everything, we give them an example. We don't have to print the thing, but we ought to give them an example.
I would think it would be, I don't even know if we've started even thinking about this, but are we going to create some sort of standard language or communication that can be used?
Yes, we did that for Harris Teeter, and we did that for all
Yeah.
the businesses.
It would be, I would think, if I were a business owner, I would love you to do that. It would be clear, it would be
Yeah.
the right size, it would be the right lettering, get that up.
Something that we haven't even talked about yet.
I can send you guys 20 photographs of a whole variety of scary-looking signs
Right, they're pretty
on
good.
the doors of businesses in Greenwich, Connecticut for reference.
Okay, and Mary Ann, you started to say
And we
something?
haven't even talked about how we're gonna handle communicating with visitors.
Right, which we will need to, while it's not in the ordinance, we need to talk afterwards about
Absolutely.
how we're gonna deal with that. Okay, any other,
Yeah, Craig.
yeah.
I did want to raise the issue that you and I have talked about, and I realize I'm the only one. I'm not wedded to this, but I did want to raise it. When I look at the face mask, patrons are required to wear a face mask when they enter a business. I see two possible issues with that. One is the sanction is $25 plus assessment. Forgetting about the amount of it, it's very, very hard to enforce. We are not going to have roaming code compliance officers, and we don't have a lot of code compliance officers. The other thing is I worry a little bit that way, here's a box of masks. Now, I also note that no other ordinance I have read in any other town has actually tried that, so I don't know whether there's a legal issue.
Foley
They just
has.
don't wanna do it.
Well, why don't we talk about both the, and this is probably the right place to talk about it, both the logical enforcement capability issue of doing that and then the legal issue. And I have been reluctant to do that. And case in point would be the issues that today we're having with Harris Teeter. The problem that I would raise is that these, you know, by placing the enforcement requirement on the store, you're putting them in a position that they may or may not be able to deal with. I mean, we gotta think of these as you know, we've seen this problem with Harris Teeter. The way that we wrote our ordinance with respect to occupancy and the requirement of one person per store was written that Harris Teeter was the entity on the hook for that. And the challenge, and that is for them, is that they don't have a security staff. They're not trained to address and take on hostile customers. Their employees did not sign up to be enforcement officers, and you find yourself potentially putting a 20-year-old kid at the door when 4 40-year-old guys here for a golf weekend decide, well, screw you, I'm going in the store. It's problematic. When the older person at Indigo Books has to try to tell a family you're leaving the store, I think it's a difficult thing to put them in that position of having to they can do, and they will do what they can to try to nicely educate people, say, see the sign, you need to be here. And I think most of our business owners will make a best effort. But my concern is that by levying the fine on them or putting that responsibility on them, you are putting an employee in a position where they're going to be fined by the town for doing something that they just aren't qualified to do, and that gives me some pause. But I'm open to.
I hear you, and I respect that, because I do think it's tough on the establishments. I also think, and I may be wrong, that we're going to be surprised by how many members of the public will step forward if they see a violator and suggest to that person
Absolutely.
they put a mask on or get out. I think that's going to happen, because I think people are not going to tolerate, for their own personal safety reasons, people who don't comply with the law. So I think we're going to be supported by the general public on these issues, which will help on the enforcement side. Great.
You have a higher level of confidence in the general public than I do.
Yeah, I might be, but
I do agree with Dan, and people feel pretty strongly about masks, and I think that if they see someone who's not wearing it, who's really threatening their own safety, they're gonna say something.
And I will just reiterate what I think Klaus said, is that most cities, including the Municipal Association model code, does not put that burden on businesses. On the other hand, for Folly, that is written in, we're voting this afternoon, but that is currently in the code and in our proposed ordinance, and my compromise there, it's not really an option here, was that the business, if they post and people refuse, and they ask and people refuse, they have to call public safety. And if they do all that, they're going to be fined. They're not going to be subject to any penalty. So they have an out. I don't think you want to create a confrontation between a business and a customer, as Craig pointed out. I think
Right.
that's a legitimate concern. So,
Yeah, I don't, I mean, I'm just uncomfortable telling the, you know,
Yeah.
older employee I mean, these are family shops, an older employee in one of these shops and saying, well, boy, if you don't take on this person who wants to come in here,
You can't do that.
we're gonna fine you a couple $100. That's something that we wanna do. We ought to, but because if we don't, then we need to make sure, in which we're getting to, what are the other ways we do it, then we need to make sure, do we have the code compliance coverage that we need so that a code compliance person can be involved in the situation, or we have talked with the sheriff's department, which we'll get into, as to what role they can play. So I think there are, you know, avenues that we have to help that person out, but I'm uncomfortable. But
I am
I've
too.
got it down, and we're gonna come back through these, and so at that point, when we come back through, if somebody wants to make a motion to amend that item, we can.
Right, also, no, I would not, maybe, no, I wanted to bring it up for discussion. And I wanted the other council members' feedback on it. As I said, I'm not wedded to this. I see the counter arguments. I would point out that, here in Greenwich, from what I can tell, there's 100% compliance of the public without security guards or
Right.
trips to the stores, much like the way it works. I am very confident that we're going to get that in Kiowa too with the residents. I am a little leery of the short-term renters who come and go, which is why I guess we just need to discuss enforcement in general.
Yeah.
But if, you know, there seems to be there are good arguments against what I suggested, so I'm perfectly happy to drop it.
To be clear, though, the businesses are subject to fines if they fail to
Post.
post or, so.
correct.
The business are being held
And
to
their
account.
employees,
Yeah, okay.
and they are responsible
Well,
for their
no, they're not
employees.
held to account if they let someone in and serve it without wearing the mask.
Correct.
But I think there are ways,
Okay, I think we can move on.
Okay.
I understand the counter arguments and I accept that.
All right, number 8,
Before we do that, one thing, I think as I read number 3 and 7, we're repetitive between 3 and 7. Certainly the second half of 7 is repetitive of 3. Perhaps we can clean language up, but if you go back and look at number 3 and reread number 7, we're saying the same thing twice.
Well, I would just say the point in number 7 is for clarity for businesses to know what's expected of them.
Well, number 3 says businesses are required to post a notice in their business.
Oh,
Visible to customers entering the business or waiting to enter the business. And number 7 says businesses and restaurants are required to post a notice in their business visible to customers entering the business. If that's not repetitive, I'm not sure what is.
well, the first part of 3 is not repetitive
No.
of 7, it's the second sentence.
Right.
Yeah,
We
fine.
could eliminate the second sentence in number 3 and put it all in the businesses are responsible, number 7, and be
Yes.
fine.
Okay.
Good point.
All right, number 8, this emergency ordinance may be enforced by the town's code enforcement officers. Persons violating the emergency ordinance will be subject to a criminal fine of $25 plus required statutory assessments. Businesses not requiring employees to wear face coverings will be subject to a criminal fine of $100 plus required statutory assessments. Each day of infraction is considered a separate offense. In addition, any violation may be charged as an infraction with any other relevant civil or criminal penalties contained in the Kiowa Islands Municipal Code or civil and criminal penalties under state law or federal law. And I'm not going to read the rest of this because it's legalese. But the point of this, that does need to be discussed. So in the feedback that I've heard from some of you, and then the feedback from some of the public, it didn't come up a lot, but it did come up in a number of public comments, was the concern that $25 was too low. Now, there isn't a right number. We've looked at what other entities are doing, municipalities are doing. I think Charleston's $50. I think Beaufort is doing today 25 or 50. I don't know. What are you doing at Folly?
that one I didn't,
Yeah,
no, it might be 100, a flat 100. I'm not positive. I unfortunately didn't print that one up.
and so, we did hear some comments that, well, is this going to be too small of a penalty to get people's attention? The irony is not lost on me of how many emails I get about how outrageous our penalties are for our other violence or ordinance violations. But the one thing I would remind people on this is that the way our penalties are calculated, there is the state run-up. So ultimately, a $25 penalty is really a $50. Stephanie, it's really a $50 penalty, right? We list it as a 25, but ultimately, if they are guilty of that, the state assessments are taxed. So it really becomes a 50. So people who are going, well, I'd really like to have a $50 penalty. This really is a $50 penalty, and my concern would be if we went to 50, then when people got ticketed and they found out that that was 100, we're going to have crossed a threshold where all of a sudden people are going to go, whoa, I was okay with 25 or 50. This became a serious. So I would be reluctant to increase it to 50, but I'm open to the will of the town council. I do think, though, that a lot of the feedback we heard is because there's a lack of understanding of what the effective rate of a fine is. Yeah. Is there an appetite to?
I think if someone really doesn't want to wear a mask and wants to be a jerk about it, 25 or 50 or 100 is not going to deter him or her. I think this will live or die.
This will be a second amendment.
Voluntary compliance with a legal background. You tell people you have to do this. I really suspect, a couple of weeks or so, we're going to see broad compliance. I think Harris Teeter is a little bit of an issue, but I like the suggestion that Dan made, certainly to me, which is, I think we just need someone outside the door there for the first weeks.
A couple other things to sort of as background for, I assume we have people listening to this meeting, which came up in some of the discussions, some of the emails that we got, is that there's obviously law enforcement on this island is complicated. And so, there are a lot of misunderstandings or just don't understand of what's the role of the community association security organization versus our Charleston County officers, versus our town code compliance organization. So a couple of these I just did want to address. There were questions, well, can't we get Kika security people up at Freshfields, or can't they be? And the answer is no. They are a private security organization that can that works for the community association and can enforce the community association's rules and regulations, and but they don't have the authority to be able to deal with our code compliance. Also, technically, because even though we employ 4 full-time officers 24/7 on the island, that the nature of our relationship with the Charleston County Sheriff's Department is such that while those officers are paid for by us, work for us, and are dedicated to the town, the operational oversight of our officers, what they can do, is at the control of Sheriff Alcannon. Mm-hmm. And so they cannot and will not be able to enforce this from the standpoint of writing violations. So, and again, the intent here is that we aren't, if this does what it's supposed to do, we shouldn't be out there writing lots of, so it shouldn't be a big issue. But nonetheless, the officers can't, when it comes down to it, pull out a ticket book and write the $25. Only our code compliance officers can do that. and there are 2 of them, which will become germane when we get back to Mary Ann's question about the rest of the island. Now, having said that, the last thing I want to add is that what the sheriff's department will do, though, I'm sorry?
We have 4 total, two nighttime, 2 daytime, and the 2 nighttime are really part of the short-term rental.
Right.
So I think you're excluding
Did-
that.
So did I say too few or too many?
Well, you said we had 2, we really have 4.
Yeah, I
2
mean,
work
but
night shift for
I
short-term
meant
rentals.
that are on, okay, that are, because our nighttime code compliance guys could do it too. They can help, yeah, they can. Now, having said that, the sheriff's department, I reached out to Captain Martin yesterday. They clearly, of course, they work very closely with us. We consider them part of the town's law enforcement effort. They want to assist us with enforcing this, and so they will, within the limits of their operational capability, will support. They will be happy to back up assist a store owner in explaining to people what the ordinance is and that they need to comply with it. And in addition, under the law, as I understand it, if a person enters a building, an establishment without a face mask, the owner does have the ability to then ask to have a trespass complaint issued against the person. And the officers will, in fact, be ready and willing to then be involved if a trespass complaint is issued against the person. So my understanding is one of the things we would want to make sure is that store owners understand how that works and what that capability is, and in what kinds of situations they might want to do that. But and Joe, is that consistent with your understanding of the?
Yes, I mean, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I do have a point to be made about the penalties, and it's a dry legal point that we've been wrestling with for some time over these, and it's a difference between having a civil and a criminal fine. For legal reasons, in the past on our emergency ordinances, I've put in the penalty as a civil fine. It's to head off some of the state preemption arguments that could be made. I don't agree with them, to be clear. However, there's a second legal problem, and that is our municipal court currently believes it does not have jurisdiction over civil fines. And I'm working on that as well. And maybe I'll change his mind, maybe I won't. But currently, his position is he doesn't have jurisdiction. So we've switched the fines back to criminal. It is not without some risk, but the risk is that someone's going to pop up and make some arguments that I'm not going to go into detail in a public forum. But I do feel constrained to let y'all know that there are some issues out there in civil versus criminal fines. It's almost a lesser of two evils at this point on how to do that.
And you're comfortable with the way we have it?
Yes, and
Joe, sorry, I just have a question. I guess I didn't catch Craig's explanation as to why the deputies cannot, not don't want to, but cannot fine someone unless the store owner actually files a trespass complaint. Did I understand you correctly? If we define this as a criminal fine, then they can, but if it's a civil fine, they cannot?
No,
two issues are
yes,
unrelated.
they don't have authority over our ordinances. They have authority for state and to enforce state and county laws, but not our ordinances, which puts them in a different position. Which is why, for example, Charleston's in towns that have their own police departments can then establish a different set of authorities for their local police. We're at the mercy of Sheriff Cannon.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay.
I personally don't see a lot of I don't know, it bothers me to think about sheriffs going around and giving people fine notices for not wearing a mask.
But they won't be doing that.
No, I know, but I'm just picturing enforcement. And I think we're better served by having people, volunteers who give out information and say to somebody, look, you have to wear a mask, and give them a piece of paper that states all the requirements. If you notice in Charleston, they're having members of their livability group monitor the mask situation.
And so is there,
No, I mean, it's just, I have this vision of mask enforcement troops. I don't
think it's gonna happen.
I don't think it's gonna happen. And I think people, I do agree, as I said before with Dan, people are gonna be helping us get it enforced.
all right. So to finish up on number 8 then, the issue there is the 25. Is there likely to be any, when we get to ultimately making any amendments, is there going to be any strong desire to adjust that, or?
None on my part.
No.
No.
Was that a no?
Yeah, I didn't hear that. Klaus, could you say that
He said
again?
no.
Oh, he said
You
no.
said no.
Oh,
Okay.
okay.
I'm sorry, I
All right.
didn't hear it.
All right, number 9 is just a continuation of the pledge that we made early on, that any fines collected for any purpose whatsoever related to our various emergency ordinances related to COVID-19 would ultimately be added up and donated to a nonprofit organization focused on, it doesn't say it here, but we said focused on the restaurant and tourism business. 10 is, I don't think we need to talk about. Number 11, there is an issue here. It did not come up in more than one or two of our public emails, but I want to raise it myself as an issue, and that is the question of, is July 2nd the best date? I think this got in here essentially because Stephanie and I initially in drafting this said, okay, how many days once we approve it does it take to get it in effect? So I think there are a couple arguments here, or at least considerations I'd like to hear from you all on. On the one hand, we moved this out, the 2nd is Thursday, right?
It is.
So we said, look, if we approve this today, we need a couple days to make sure that we've, properly communicated this. We need to communicate to our business owners. We need to communicate to our residents, to adjoining communities like Seabrook and Johns Island who shop at Freshfields. And the big hurdle, which is trying to find some way to begin to alert the many thousands of visitors who are rolling in here. So on the one hand, we said we need a couple days to make sure that we communicate this correctly. We give business owners time to, have signs and whatever. On the other hand, we also know July, this is like right on top of the July 4th weekend when we in fact are going to be most stressed on the island with the numbers of people. I think Charleston is effective the 1st. So you could make some arguments both ways about whether there's, since we are so close to Charleston and since so many of our visitors visit both, was there some simplicity and help getting people aligned with this by having us effective at the same date as Charleston? So I think the issue out there is, are we okay with the 2nd? I did get a couple emails from people, but not many, who did say, why are we waiting so long? That's why. Is there any appetite to move that up to the 1st or the 30th?
I think we need some deferral to the staff as to when you think you can complete the necessary communication and give these guys proper notice.
We will work with the mayor in terms of, we can get communication out starting today. Whatever's passed, we would just send
Yeah, kind of the highlights, yeah.
So we can start getting stuff out, later today, tomorrow, so.
But then every one of these business owners will need signage.
Right.
Yeah, the
Yeah,
sample
yeah.
signage and stuff
Right.
like that
And
takes.
I know with the mayor talking with Julie last week and kind of understanding that this is coming, they may have already started making some preparations, but definitely I think they would need at least a good solid day and a half,
Yeah.
maybe two, to kind of get their stuff together.
Yeah, I'd love July 1st, because I think symmetry is nice, but we gotta be realistic as to what
Right.
these guys can and can't achieve. And
I think the
36
signage is,
But if we start on July 1st and there's a couple of store owners that aren't prepared yet or that don't have signage yet and tell people you have to wear a mask, I think I would live with that. I think the real big issue, as always, is Harris Teeter. I think we should start as soon as possible because the place is going to be an absolute zoo.
I think the
I-
bulk of people who aren't here but are coming for the July weekend will arrive, my guess is not later than Thursday night as opposed to Friday. I think a lot of people are going to take Friday off. So I'm comfortable with Thursday if we need the time to help everybody get prepared.
I think Thursday is fine. What I think is the most important is the signage. And I really don't have a problem if we make this effective signage on July 2nd, and then we're adding the signage as it's ready. I did have an experience with Harris Teeter yesterday where it was very positive, actually. I was waiting outside. There were 15 people in line. Magically, they were maintaining social distancing. Then when I got up to get my cart, they don't clean the carts anymore. You have to do that yourself. While I was waiting, there were two young gentlemen in around their 20s, and the employee told them that it could only be one person per family, and they pointed to the sign they had that said Kiowa Ordinance in place until August 8th, I believe it was. And as soon as they saw that, that helped get the two guys to separate. One said, okay, I'll wait out here. But it was a very positive sign. I did also notice a lot more people wearing masks than I had seen before. So I think the signage is going to help the businesses as well as spread the word, especially to vacationers. That's what I'm worried about.
So I
I
took
see.
from that everybody's okay with the second.
Yes.
It would have been nice if Stephanie were pointing at us and saying, hey, we can get this thing communicated by Wednesday. The-
Get it by later today.
Well,
Right, right.
I think what I'm saying is if you thought that people could have their communications, you'd be fine with moving it up to Wednesday rather than Thursday. But I'm not hearing.
I thought Klaus had a pretty good suggestion. Let's put in the first, but, we can wink amongst ourselves. We're not
I
gonna fight
agree.
anybody
Okay.
the
Is
first
that-
day.
Is that what I heard?
Mhm. I can go with that.
All right,
But
now
again, the
this,
sign, excuse me, if I might just say, the signage really isn't just for the businesses. I think in Freshfields, we need to have signs strategically placed to inform visitors.
most important thing,
Marion, sorry? What did Marion say?
the numbers of signs and making sure signs are actually spaced out in places where people can see them.
Not just the businesses.
Yeah. The other thing that clearly has to happen and unfortunately hasn't in other situations is that we are going to absolutely have to have the support, the active support from the 1,400 people who own rental properties on this
Oh.
island, and their property managers. When we passed the guidelines here a month ago for the cleaning and when we reopened rentals, there was a provision in there that said that part of the requirement was that that all of the town's ordinances, communications, rules, regulations with respect to rental operations needed to be communicated. And I am never going to paint with a broad brush, but it is absolutely clear that in some cases, some of our property managers and some of our owners are doing a fantastic job. But it is also very clear that in many, many cases, that has fallen on absolutely deaf ears. And this is critical because, you know, where you're gonna get your first compliance is when people are driving here with the right expectation that they are coming to a location where this is what is expected. And if they show up thinking, oh no, Kiowa's anything goes, I got no problem, I'm just there to have fun, and that's the expectation they've been led to, we have a harder time. And
I just- I'd like to add.
Make one little suggestion. I think we can help with that. Signage will take a little bit of time, but you know, little things. Let's make sure those electronic scoreboard things, whatever, don't just say welcome to Kiowa, but they say masks required to enter any store or restaurant. And I think we can do that quickly. I think let's have flyers printed that the
Hand them out.
gate entry staff and the gate entry staff give to everyone who pulls through in the left lane, and I would argue for a few days in the right lane. It doesn't hold up too much traffic, but I think people who have printed out an electronic pass from their rental agency get to go through the right lane. So I think we have to cover that one too.
And we have talked to, those are good suggestions, we already have talked to Kika. They will make the electronic signs available
Good.
for indicating. All right, so now
Mayor-
let's move on to the,
Could I just make a comment?
Sure.
And it's timely because you mentioned the cleaning procedures. I just had to rent someplace for a couple of weeks. But what bothered me the most is that you had to check out at 8, and by 5, the new family was there. And I was told, well, you know, they're sterilizing the linens and everything, but it may be time to look back at those recommendations and see if we can't tighten them up a little.
Well, the
That's it.
recommendations are great. Whether they're being
Right.
followed is a whole nother issue.
Right,
Yeah.
that's my point.
My comment earlier, you can color me cynical.
I agree with you.
I think there's a lot more confidence on some people's part than others.
No one would ever call you cynical, Chris.
yeah, I mean, it's a digression to it, but different subject, but nonetheless, you are absolutely right, Marianne. One of but it's anecdotal. The anecdotal feedback I get too often, and a lot of it comes from the villas, because
Right.
in the villa situations, you've got a property owner who may have 3 or 4 rentals, like, you know, they can
Right.
see what's going on. And I get the cleaners come in, they're in the 2-bedroom unit for 60 minutes.
Right,
And
and this was a
how
villa.
did they possibly ever provide the cleaning
They
to
didn't.
that 2-bedroom villa in 60 minutes and do the level of cleaning? And, you know, I get those all the time. So, anyway, okay, let's, we're almost done here, but we need to move on, I think, to the big issue here that Marianne has raised. One thing which is not in the ordinance today at all is any provision that addresses, right now we are only addressing people interacting with business establishments and restaurants. There is no language here that addresses the use of masks in other areas. We know that other communities in some cases have done that. Charleston has language that says that when you need to wear a mask when you are in an area where you are not, the specific language is not able to ensure 6-foot distancing.
When walking in public, where maintaining a distance of 6 feet between other members of the public at all times is not possible.
I did hear,
Wait, guys, sorry, didn't we forget something here before we get to that big one? I may have missed that, but did we address the issue of whether we are going to require patrons to wear a mask inside the restaurant unless they are seated at the table? Because that's not in the ordinance right now. There was a lot of feedback to that effect.
well, we'll come back to the specific language, but I thought that the way we described it is that they need to have on a face mask while they are waiting to be seated. That was,
And as they enter.
as they enter and as they are waiting to be seated.
So that would be inside.
So that would be inside.
I think,
That,
can I just, let me just, you know, sometimes it's useful to get feedback, how it's done elsewhere. Here in Connecticut, this is handled differently, and I saw a lot of emails that suggest that also. You are required to wear a mask on your way into the restaurant until you sit down. You don't have to wait for food, but until you sit down. If you get up from the table to go to the bathroom, you're required to don your mask. The rationale, of course, is that as you're walking to the bathroom or walking into the restaurant, you come very close to other tables.
okay, well, we're going to,
Different from,
Right.
that is different, I saw a lot of emails to that effect also. That's different from just saying while you're waiting to enter, right? And, you know, for the record, I would certainly be in favor.
it's different than why you're waiting to enter, but it's more similar to what I think the language and we're gonna walk back through these and summarize all the changes we talked about making, but I thought the language we actually had is until you are seated.
Okay, then I'm good.
That's what I thought we had. That's the note that I wrote. All right, we did not cover other locations on the island like bike paths, boardwalks, open areas in fresh fields. I know that there is language, for example, in Charleston's that would potentially require masks in those organizations. I probably heard in the public feedback, maybe from a quarter, 20%, maybe 20% asked about or addressed that question. Although that was the one area where I did have people who also were on the other side. In other words, I had people who strongly supported the ordinance for, I adamantly required to have face masks in open areas like on the basic question we have is where's the balance you find between what you like to do and your ability to actually enforce something, which I suspect is the dilemma others have. But go ahead, Marianne.
Okay. The statement that I was hoping we could include says, in any public area on Kiowa where it is not possible to maintain social distancing, a mask should be worn. Now, I said, why did I bring this up? People have asked about the boardwalk, they've asked about bike paths, talked about walking around fresh fields. And I just think it's, you know, I think the situation is so serious right now in South Carolina that whatever we can do to make an effort to protect our residents and our visitors is what we should recommend. And I think this is a step that we should take. It would cover any questionable areas.
Chris?
Could you read the statement again? I want to make sure.
Sure.
I understood it.
In any public area on Kiowa where it is not possible to maintain social distancing, a mask should be worn.
I have no issues with the statement. I think it's right. I think we're kidding ourselves that it's going to be enforced.
And I didn't.
I think we're trying to virtue signal, if we're trying to provide symbolism over substance, I'm with you. But we've got 4 code enforcement officers, and they're not going to be riding the bike paths or walking the boardwalks. I hope we prioritize enforcement at fresh fields and primarily Harris Teeter. I think that's the pinch point most of us are concerned with. I don't disagree with your comment. I just think that we're getting into an area that makes us feel good as opposed to really is going to change anybody's conduct.
And I wasn't referring to the beach.
I think it's a little more than that, Chris, actually. I have some issues with this, for the record, I'm obviously no medical professional whatsoever. I
talking
because
about
of
the
the
beach.
risk that someone might pass you within 4 feet or with 5 feet. If you think about the time that you are in close proximity, that is probably inside a second. The research, the science seems very clear that it is prolonged exposure that is primarily an issue. Now,
And
it is
and,
without a doubt.
Claus, if I
without a
could,
doubt- let me just, yeah.
I just to stop you there and add the point that, as you know, we've, worked closely with MUSC and relied on them for a lot of advice. And they were they were essentially unequivocal with us with that regard. They said you are not going to contract this virus by passing somebody on a bicycle on a bike path. And you were not, because there was not sufficient duration, and you were outdoors. Now, there are nevers, but the advice we have got has said that those kinds of situations are not a risk. Now, we also know that they're learning about this disease, and what was 2 weeks ago's advice could be different today.
Let
I'm
me,
gonna-
let me add two other things to that briefly. One, I would point out, again, Connecticut, which has been very, very strict. I told you there's literally 100% indoor mask compliance, including in restaurants. If you're getting up to go to the restroom, you gotta wear a mask and so on. On the street, on the sidewalks, you don't see a lot. A few people, but not a lot, and no one seems to get excited about it. The other point I would make is that, yes, that goes to the feel-good factor. At the margin, of course, always wearing a mask is better than not always wearing a mask. At the margin. I would just point out the blindingly obvious, which is at the margin, staying at home at all times is even better. So we can push this to a point where you really wonder about diminishing returns here, and I think that might be it.
Dan?
Well, I'm just, if I might also say, I was not referring to the beach, because I think the beach patrol is doing a good job of separating large groups and continuing to monitor. I was elected to represent the people, and when people come to me with suggestions, I like to try and help get them, whether I agree totally with it or not. But if MUSC says it's not gonna happen, then I can go along with that.
Dan?
The,
Right, could you summarize what was said about the beach?
She's excluding the
She's
beach.
excluding the beach.
Okay, thank you.
yeah, everything that I have read and the two physicians I've talked to about this issue say, as we've learned from MUSC, the chance of you contracting this disease from passing on a bike, walking past somebody when you're moving and you're outside, in both cases you are, is so small at this point based on the evidence they have that it's not worth pursuing. I think that, in addition to the fact that the enforceability is impossible, would lead me to say this is the careful edge here. Let's not go that far. It makes no sense, in my opinion, to require that. I don't like the idea.
The concern that I have, to some extent, there are parts of the island where I can actually be sympathetic to that argument, is I don't know what behavior, if we did this, we're telling people they can't do. And I know Stephanie and I kind of went back and forth this morning about a bike pass, which are, bike pass and boardwalks are the one. So if somebody then, if we enacted this, said, okay, well then are you telling me I need a mask on a bike path or not? I don't know how to ask that. I do not know how to answer that, because I don't know whether it's, well, yes, because if you pass somebody, there's not going to be 6 feet, or is it, well, no, it's negotiable as long as you signal to the person when they're coming and you go off the grass 2-way. I don't know what we end up telling people, and then I'm of course concerned because when we put ordinances in place and they don't get enforced, I get the calls that are from, well, why is the town not enforcing this ordinance? And I will get I was crossing boardwalk 36 and there was a group there and they didn't move and they didn't have boardwalk. And we know we don't have a code of compliance officer that's gonna be there. So
fine.
I really do appreciate, and I'm very empathetic or sympathetic to the concerns people have. I just absolutely don't know how to enforce it. And
I
I don't
think-
even know how to guide people to say, well, what behavior are they really supposed to do that is different than what we've been telling people for 4 months, which is social distance, be considerate. If you see people coming towards you, move out of the way, you know. Now, having said that, I will tell you, Freshfields is a little different situation. I was sitting with Julie last week, who manages that facility. We were looking down at the common area. It was packed.
Right.
People were all, you know, together, and I kind of get in that environment where you've got lots of people who are really crammed together without mask, and it's a very different situation than, you know, 2 bikes passing each other on a boardwalk. So yeah, I struggle with it, but I have this sense that, and it's always been my view, that if we're gonna put ordinances and rules in place, we need to be serious about them and do the things that we can enforce. And if we put things in place that we can't enforce, we essentially then begin to dilute the whole ordinance, because it
disagree with
becomes
you.
evident to people, they're not serious about it, they're not gonna enforce it. And it's very clear from the feedback we have that people are very concerned about Freshfields, they're very concerned about Harris Teeter, they're very concerned about the restaurants, the places, they have to come together in close quarters. And that, at the end of the day, it's a problem, but people can maneuver themselves through the boardwalks and but.
That's fine. I'm fine. Yeah.
I will tell you that from the feedback we have, there will be a lot of people who are unhappy with that position, the position that we've just
Right.
got to, and I realize
It's
that.
fine, we
for
can't do
record.
everything and,
Just a point, I think I'm the only one here, you don't have time.
Dave,
Public comments?
I did not know who was behind the mask.
That's one of the good things about the masks.
Okay, so to the mic, people can't hear when they say
You know what, with the small room, I don't mind people,
they can't
They
hear.
can't hear.
We have-
Okay,
we
okay.
have almost 200 viewers,
okay.
they can't hear.
I'm just trying to avoid people moving around and,
Yeah, he's not
Okay.
touching, he's not close to anybody.
yeah.
Dave DiStefano, 31 Burrows Hall. I had a list of comments here. Fortunately, just about all of them were addressed, and I was in agreement with the way they were addressed. A few things. I think it should be all employees in the restaurants. I think that's, there may be some exceptions where somebody's working a fry later, maybe they're afraid of something, but I mean, it's actually gonna protect them from getting splashed, so I think that's it. The other thing is we use the word restaurants a lot. I've seen, for instance, where the post office is there, people have been waiting in line. I've been out there with 6 or 7 people in line. You wanna get out of the sun, they have 2 benches. So I think, you know, the word restaurants with, if you're in line for a business, it obviously should be all businesses. I think it says that, but I just heard a lot about restaurants with that. I think the rental agencies, you addressed that, should be informing their renters about this. There should be a summary of this. I agree that it should be passed out at the gate, particularly on Saturdays. And as far as enforcement's concerned, I know we don't have that many enforcement people, but I think the biggest day for enforcement is Saturday afternoons and Sunday mornings at Freshfields. These renters are checking in, they're going shopping, and I think if we have an enforcement person out there specifically on those days to let these people know right away that there is an enforcement procedure, and, you know, an example of kind of like a way to enforce something. I remember at the PGA, they had camera police. And I'm at the 17th hole, somebody took out their cell phone, and this guy went right over, and he said, you can't take any pictures, put it back in your pocket. He put a sticker on it, okay? It was a little over. And I finally asked the enforcement guy, I said, the cameras don't make any noise. He says, we make an example out of one person every time a foursome comes up, just so you know we're enforcing it. I said, what's the reason for enforcing it? Ironically, it wasn't the click of the camera. It's they don't want all of these pictures of the PGA players picking their nose, et cetera, going on the internet. So, but it was just as soon as he went to one person and said, you can't do that, put a sticker on his phone, everybody's phone went into their pocket. So if there's somebody out on a Saturday,
talking to somebody, an enforcement person, and other people see it. I just think that's gonna be really helpful to let people know that there are enforcement people, because they don't know we don't have 50 people out there. You know, if they see one doing something, they're gonna say, oh, this is serious stuff. And I think the ordinance is great, and as far as, Mary, what you read, where it's not possible to keep social distancing, we're all as individuals, if we're in a situation where we're uncomfortable, avoid it. If you're on the sidewalk and there's 5 people walking at you without masks on, I think we can, there's enough geography here on the island, and I think you can, it's pretty easy to keep your distance if you want to. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. All right, here's the way I would like to go about this is, let's go ahead and I'll ask for, what our approach will be, I'm going to ask for a motion to approve Ordinance 2020-04, an emergency ordinance of the Town Council of the Town of Cuba Island regarding face coverings, in a second. Once we have that, then what I'd like to do is I will walk through all of my notes of the changes that we said we were going to, I'm not going to try to do specific language, but the changes, and if Joe and Stephanie and Petra between them can, is conceptually get those changes, then is it possible, can I then just make a motion to amend the ordinance to adopt those changes in their entirety?
Yeah, you can do it either way, one at a
Okay.
time or their entirety, as long as we remember to vote on the ordinance at the end of the day.
And then at the end,
Right.
we'll vote on the ordinance. Right. Time to do that. Will that work?
Yeah.
Because I'm sure the people on the phone are going to wonder when this is going to end. Okay, so do I have a motion to adopt ordinance 2020-04?
So moved.
Do I have a second?
Second.
All right. Now, these are the, and again, add in where you don't, but we have no change to number 1. We have no change to number 2. In number 3, we are doing 3 things. We are making it where we say entering any business, it will be entering or waiting to enter any business. And we will be adding club facilities and association facilities as part of the definition of a business. And we will be subtracting the second sentence in its entirety. Did I get that one right?
Correct.
In number 4, we are going to clean this language up to be more clear. We will leave the language that is there, but we will add to it the specific, the actual reference to the language in the South Carolina Lodging Association, so that the language actually reads that employees who interact with customers will be required to have a mask at all time. That will be the result of the language change. Did I get that right?
I believe so, although I'm not sure. I thought Mary Ann wanted to come back to that debate in terms of those interacting with customers versus all.
All employees.
Yeah, so
Yeah, in the kitchen, everybody.
that's not what, it's different. I'm
It-
just trying to point out that
Right.
we have a discrepancy.
So, so we have 2 different views on the question of whether we include all employees. So we will, what I suggest, and if you are still holding to want to have a vote on that, I will hold that one out separate. We'll approve everything else, and then we'll come back and we'll actually discuss this one. Number 5, we eliminated the language with respect to social distancing at least 6 feet away from other persons. And we are instead going to insert language that will mean that, let's see here.
I think number 5 becomes repetitive because you've covered it with your change in number 3. When you say all persons, including employees, either entering or waiting to enter a business, which is what you've changed number 3 to.
Well, but in 3, we excluded restaurants, so 5 is going to be,
Restaurants.
it is restaurants, and what we're going to do, the language there was to ensure that, that the people are required to wear a mask while they are waiting and up until the time that they, are seated.
Okay, but 5 today doesn't say restaurants. And we can certainly add it, I'm not objecting to it, but
It
today
would be,
5 doesn't reference
it'd be
restaurants
clear
at
if
all.
we probably said restaurants.
Craig, sorry, up until the time that
Oh.
they are seated and at any time that they leave their table again.
Yes.
Yeah, I like that, when you leave the table, you ought to
Right.
have your mask on, yeah.
I would do it the other way around. It's easier. You may take your mask off in a restaurant only while seated at the table. I think that's the easier way of doing it.
Is this part of
Six.
5?
Or it,
That's 5, that's
Well, it's-
5,
and five.
that's 5. Is everybody okay with that?
Yes.
Number 6, we
Could
took
I-
off item E.
Could I raise a point about 5? Because there was a comment made, and I thought it was a good one. Waiting to enter a business establishment or pick up a carry-out order. Is that something y'all wanted to include in there?
Yes.
Yes, yes.
Okay. Number 6, we only took out item E.
You could potentially, Craig, take out C if you're using the seated provision in 5.
Yes. But I might leave it in, just,
Okay.
perhaps someone's eating or drinking someplace else.
Oh,
Well, I guess 5, is that gonna apply to restaurants or all businesses?
That 5 applies to restaurants.
Business and restaurants, he was gonna add restaurants to it.
oh,
Well, then, I just feel like 6C may still serve a purpose.
okay, that's fine.
All right.
Leave it in.
On
We're
7,
gonna take E out though, right?
yes, we took E out. On 7, we took out essential,
Right.
and we are adding words to indicate that they must post a notice, that the notice must be posted at the entry point,
At all entry points.
at all entry points. I have that we talked about making a change, but did not ultimately make a change. Do you have a change in 8?
No,
No. We talked about the whole issue of making the businesses liable for and we said no.
yeah, I don't think that.
Okay, I have nothing in 9, I have nothing in 10. We changed 11 to July 1. And no other changes.
12, we adjusted, it says July 1, we have to make it.
Oh, we have to change the
28 and August
and
27th.
27th, okay. All right, so what I would first do is ask for a motion to incorporate, a motion to amend ordinance 2020-4 to include the changes just summarized.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, then I want to come, all right, and then I want to come back to, number 4, where we have, I think, 2 different views on the table. One is to stay with the language that was described here, which would be covering those people, requiring a mask for those restaurant employees who are interacting directly with their customers, whether that be, you know, the waiter or wait server, whether it be somebody bringing pizza out to the curb, whether it be the person seating. The alternative view that was discussed, that's what the language says now. Is there anyone who wishes to make a motion for consideration that would alter that in any way?
Well, I was recommending that all employees, including the food prep people, should wear masks, unless there's a safety reason why they shouldn't.
So the point of.
I could not hear that.
Well, so Mary Ann is indicating that she still has a desire to see this provision affect all employees in a restaurant, regardless of whether they are directly interacting with the customers. And so, Mary Ann, if you feel the desire to do so, the appropriate action would be for you to make a motion with the language that you would like to have. And if it is seconded, then I will bring it to a vote of the council.
I would say restaurants should require all employees to adopt and enforce the face covering provisions of the Phase 2 recommendations prepared and published by the South Carolina Restaurant and Lodging Association.
Okay, so we have a motion, in the essence of which makes the face covering requirement affect all employees regardless of whether they have direct interaction with employees. Do I have a second?
All right, I'd like to unless there's a safety reason why they should not.
Do I have a second? Okay, we don't have a second.
Okay.
So we, however, still have then the adjustments that we have made to this. So do I have a motion to make the changes that were discussed, which was to clarify the language in here that it in fact did require masks by all employees interacting directly with the public?
For number four, you mean?
Number 4, yeah, yeah.
So moved.
Yeah, so moved. Do I have a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All right. Do I have any other motions to any other possible changes to the amendment? Okay, hearing none. We have a motion and a second. Do I need a new motion as with the inclusion of the amendments, or just a motion as for the ordinance as it has been amended? Got it. All right. Do I have a motion to vote on the ordinance as it's been amended?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All right. Any further discussion?
No, sir.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All right. Thank you. So that has been approved. Obviously, to everybody listening, it's going to be very confusing for a little while here as to what language has been added and subtracted, although I think hopefully we were clear on the intent. We will clean this up, I think, right after this meeting and sit down and make sure we get the final document in everybody's hands. And then I think the most critical thing, obviously, is that we need to work on the communication of this. If you have any suggestions, obviously we want to get the document. We need to get this out to our business owners. We need to get it out in the community to our residents. We will need to put together some sort of a communication to our rental owners and property managers. We do need to also, I think, Stephanie, sit down with our code compliance officers and really talk about a plan of action for the next, particularly maybe for the next week, on how they're going to, I mean, they have other parts of their job, so how are they going to focus their time? Where do we want them to be? What sort of presence? And I think I'd like to do the same thing with our law enforcement, our you're saying no? Well, no, I know they're not, I know they can't, but what they can do and are willing to do is at least,
Offer support.
offer
A
support.
presence.
That's in the fall.
Okay,
The,
all right.
Craig, if my comment, one of the things that I think would be helpful, obviously, is a focus on fresh fields, especially during this next week and over the 4th of July weekend. If there is any way that code compliance could assist fresh fields, specifically
think that-
Harris Teeter,
And I
that
think
would be
that's where,
helpful.
I think that's where our focus will be. Yeah.
That'd be great.
The last two comments I want to make are, one, I want to thank all of the people in the community who so quickly responded with their thoughts and comments. It was, as I said, in my 6 years, that's the biggest response that I've seen to, a request for comment, and I appreciated it. And I'm sorry I couldn't write back to each person and acknowledge it, but we clearly read every one. We will at some point make sure you all get copies of all of them. I hope we have represented what we heard from people accurately. And so I appreciate that very much. I also want to make sure before anybody comments that's watching, it's ironic, obviously, that we're dealing with a face mask requirement, and two of us are here without face masks. So I do want to make sure that I acknowledge that, but that we talked about that ahead of time. We obviously are going to have to make some decisions and changes in our operations going forward. We had gone back a couple weeks ago to public meetings instead of doing Zoom. I think we're going to have to now rethink that, and whether that's what we want to do or not, and how to make that work. But for people who can't see it, we have gone to length here to make sure we are distanced out as best that we can. You can't see the audience, but there are three people in the audience, and they are spread out all over. And we'll have to work our way through this. So I acknowledge that the next time we have a meeting, which is next Tuesday, we will have this ordinance in place, and we will need to think our way through how we do that. But Chris and I shared, well, we didn't share the same golf cart this week, so I guess we,
Well, I shared it with another guy.
yeah. So, let me just go down the line. Start with Claus. Any comments?
No.
Marianne?
Yes. Thank you, Mayor. Sometimes we don't see the forest through the trees. Today we were talking about masks, but it's really a much bigger problem than that. QI is not nirvana as much as we think it might be. When the COVID-19 first hit residents, the residents followed the recommendations to a T, and we were successful in escaping any major cases. But now it's different. The state statistics are frightening, and it is time to reckon with the reality that this is not nirvana. State statistics show that the number of new cases reported, this is as of yesterday, was 1,599. Total cases in South Carolina, 31,850. Number of new deaths, 15. Total number of deaths in South Carolina, 707. Number of hospitalized patients, 908. The percent of tests that were positive, 19.6, a new high. Total number of tests in South Carolina, 389,096. Charleston County has led the state in new confirmed cases. We need to take personal responsibility and consider ourselves and others in our community. Let's not be selfish. Help flatten the curve and follow the recommendations. Thank you.
Thanks, Marianne. Dan, any?
Just two quick comments. I'd like to thank you, Mr. Mayor, and the staff at the town for all the work that went into this. I think this was exceptional. and I appreciate it. I also want to say that I think, as Mary Ann has just stated, most of us thought maybe at this point in time we would be on the downside of a curve. We're clearly not, and I think everybody in our community realizes how serious this is, and hopefully we'll all, on a voluntary basis, move forward with a new outlook on how serious this disease is.
Right.
And I agree. I mean, anybody that looks at the numbers, what still is still frustrating, I know, to us, is that we still don't have good insight into Keel Island specifically.
Right.
And, you know, for any of the residents that are listening, we've tried. We have made overtures to DHEC, to our representatives, to try to get reporting at a municipal level, and we can't make it happen. We get the 29455 area code, and you know, anybody that sees that, you know, during what we thought was the height of this, that number was about 5 next to our area code every day, and I think it was up to what, about 140 or 150 in the one report I got Sunday. Now, you know, whether any of that is Keela, I don't know. So it's frustrating. Because we really can't tell our residents what's actually being experienced here. So we just have to continue to do everything we can. All right. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
Okay, thanks.